Chapter 3. Petrarchan Humanism. The revival of classical antiquity may have been incidental to the purposes of the Franciscan Renaissance, but there was also a humanistic Renaissance which prioritized that revival. It all began when a young Francesco Petrarca was inspired by his love of antiquity and of classical rhetoric to abandon the law and pursue the life of a poet and antiquarian. He wrote a Latin epic in the very best classical style entitled Africa, about Rome's war with Carthage under the illustrious general Scipio Africanus. On April the 8th, 1341, Petrarch had himself crowned poet laureate in honor of this accomplishment, though he had yet to finish it. In his spare time, he scoured the libraries of Europe for long-forgotten works by classical authors, his most notable discovery being a collection of Cicero's letters, the Epistolae ad Atticum, in the Capitolary Library of Verona Cathedral in 1345. Through his immersion in ancient texts, Petrarch became a denizen of a distant Roman world. Petrarch's neoclassical poetry was inspired by what Dante had accomplished in the Divine Comedy, though Petrarch regarded Dante more as a foil than an example to be imitated. Petrarch's own father having been exiled from Florence with Dante, Petrarch was not one to doubt the magnitude of Dante's achievement or Dante's status in the pantheon of Italian poets. Yet Petrarch claimed never to have read the Divine Comedy, despite Boccaccio's urging, because he preferred not to be influenced by it. Written in the vernacular and in a highly idiosyncratic mixture of classical genres, the Divine Comedy is to classical literature approximately what Gothic architecture is to classical architecture. High style mingles with low, myth fuses with history, antiquity merges with the present, and tragedy, comedy, epic, and Augustinian autobiography are rolled up into one. The result is brilliant, highly creative, and totally at variance with every rule of art. Petrarch's Africa, by contrast, is composed with the utmost fidelity to the rules of a classical epic. The style, the meter, the structure, the tropes, all are carefully studied and repeated with no flights of fancy and no vulgar injections of contemporary idioms. It is perhaps fitting that the Africa was never finished, because it was not destined to enjoy the success of the Divine Comedy. Ironically, Petrarch's most widely read work would not be his Latin epic, but his collection of love poetry written in the vernacular. Though Petrarch's example did inspire 2 centuries of neoclassical oratory, deployed by princes eager to cloak themselves in the aura of Romanitas, and his example also proved decisive in the arts of design. Renaissance architects applied as much rigor to the recovery of classical orders as Petrarch did to the classical epic. Renaissance sculptors cut their teeth making virtuous forgeries of classical statuary, and Renaissance painters recreated famous paintings of classical myths described in Pliny's Natural History. Petrarchan humanism may be defined as an intellectual movement as well as a system of education based on Latin and Greek literature. A burgeoning interest in classical texts had been nurtured since the Carolingian Renaissance, and after the founding of the university system in the 12th century, there was no dearth of scholarship on classical texts. Yet the medieval universities were ideally suited for the education of lawyers and theologians, but not of poets or statesmen. Petrarch's answer to all that was lacking in medieval scholasticism was the Studia Humanitatis, a more informal program of education through private tutelage designed to teach one the virtues of citizenship. Civic education is human education, the study of how to be human. For as Aristotle said, man is the political animal. Humanists were united by a secular outlook, not in an irreligious sense, but in that their goals concerned the proper use of temporal power by the laity. Keenly aware of the political fragmentation of Italy and the endemic warfare which plagued the Italian city-states, as well as the consequent banditry and piracy which inhibited trade, Petrarch proposed that an education in the civic virtues of the ancient Romans could bring about a new golden age of peace and prosperity like the Pax Romana. What cities needed was to build libraries to educate the sons of the ruling class in grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, all subjects which would equip them with the eloquence, morality, and good examples that were needed to share in the governance of their city. As he stood atop the Capitoline Hill to receive his crown of laurels and give his coronation oration, Petrarch described a vast cultural discontinuity between the city that lay in ruins before his eyes and the Rome of antiquity, and he took it upon himself to inspire the Roman people to recover their heritage. Before Petrarch, scholars oblivious of such historical discontinuity read classical literature as if they inhabited the same world as Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, a misperception encouraged by a sense of affinity to ancient Christian authors such as Saint Augustine. For lack of historical awareness, Netherlandish painters freely depicted the ancient world in anachronistic contemporary dress, as if the Western Roman Empire had not fallen almost 1,000 years before. With a keen historical awareness, Petrarch sensed the stark difference between the Italy of his experience and the Italy of which he read. Humanists envisioned antiquity as a golden age of great men, great deeds, and good morals, and they recast the period after the fall of Rome as the Dark Age, marked by the decline of Roman virtues, letters, and arts. Humanists popularized the term Medioevo, the Middle Ages, and it was they who construed the 14th century as the beginning of a new golden age of classical learning and culture. It was Petrarch who drew the battle lines between the ancients and the moderns. Unlike previous scholars, Petrarch did not merely compose commentaries about classical texts, but rivaled them on their own terms, and he inspired painters, sculptors, and architects to do likewise in their respective domains, on the model of Ciceronian rhetoric. Humanism carried the art of painting from a mere craft up the steep slopes of Mount Parnassus into the realm of poetic inspiration. What elevates high art is not only the grandeur of its scale, the seriousness of its subject matter, the perfection of its form, or the beauty of its color. Above all, it is the truth-bearing function of high art which elevates it. Its purpose is not only to please, but also to instruct, as Horace writes in the Ars Poetica. Poetry is paradigmatic of high art, since it is in language that truth is born. It is in language that the nature of things is first disclosed upon their being named, and it is in language that God first revealed himself through the Old Covenant. Being at the origin of both natural and divine revelation, poetry and rhetoric are the primordial forms of art. All art, writes Martin Heidegger, is, in essence, poetry. Hence, from the very first Renaissance treatise on painting, Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura, published in 1435, to the very last, Ludovico Dolce's Dialogo della Pittura, a dialogue on painting, published in 1557, the craft of painting was elevated to the status of a liberal art by modeling it on the art of rhetoric. Alberti instructed the painter not merely to copy what others had done, but to be inventive, just like poets and orators who have many embellishments in common with painters. Following Alberti's advice, ambitious painters sought the company of humanists to learn from their example. Of the foremost artists of the High Renaissance, none had a classical education, but their works suggest otherwise, because they worked in collaboration with the great humanists of the day, such as Ludovico Dolce, who was a close friend and collaborator of Titian's. Alberti and Dolce subdivided the art of painting into three parts, which correspond to the three canons of rhetoric. The first and most important canon of rhetoric was called inventio. As Alberti observes, the greatest praise of the poet and orator consists in invention. In a typical grammar school education, the first subject of study once students had a passable grasp of Latin was Cicero's De Inventione, on invention, a title which could also be rendered on the discovery of an argument. It was an eminently practical textbook for the majority of students headed either for the clergy or for the law, who needed to be skilled in the art of persuasion. By applying Cicero's principles of invention to painting, theorists turned painting into an art of persuasion as well. According to Dolce, la invenzione viene da due parti, dalla storia e dall'ingegno del pittore, which is to say that invention comes from two sources, from the tales told by historians and poets, and from the ingenuity of the painter. The challenge is quite simply to select a subject and arrange it in a novel and ingenious way. The subject would not, as a rule, be made up out of whole cloth, because invention is a discovery of something which already exists and not creation out of nothing. The true poet, according to Petrarch, is not an inventor of tall tales, but the historian poet, who takes as his raw material historical, moral, divine, and natural truths, and then presents them under the veil of a pleasing fiction, As Petrarch explains in the Africa, one who makes up what he relates should not be honored by the title of a poet, nor deemed a seer, but rather called a liar. The subject is the matter of poetic invention on which the artist's genius goes to work. The form of poetic invention is the novelty of the arrangement, which makes the subject singular and new, freeing the story to be itself again, having become old and stale. As a given subject becomes too familiar, the less its conventional representations communicate, since a viewer is unlikely to look closely at a painting which is too recognizable, supposing that he already knows what he would see. Who needs eyes when one has knowledge? Who needs ears to hear oneself speak? Only the unforeseen can interrupt this thoughtless prejudice and prevent the work of art from devolving into conceptual equipment, which disappears in the performance of its conceptual function. In an original painting, the subject reappears as if for the very first time, as the artwork boldly proclaims its existence, compelling one to stop and to look. Paradoxically, the most original inventions, such as Bellini's St. Francis in Ecstasy, call one's attention to the subject matter by provocatively concealing it. The subject matter shows itself most clearly when concealed by a creative recombination of iconography, which obliges one to linger and ponder diverse interpretations. Alberti, for his part, did not apply the canons of rhetoric directly to painting, as Dolce later did, but analyzed the craft in terms more natural to painting and merely analogous to rhetoric. His categories are entirely intuitive, consisting of circumscriptio compositio and receptio luminum, meaning drawing, composition, and color. Alberti's imitator of nature begins exactly as one would expect, by drawing contour lines. Each form is circumscribed. Although there are no such lines in nature, human vision is acutely sensitive to the borders of things, because the mind is object-oriented. The eye does not see raw sensory data, but discrete objects with a form and a function, susceptible of circumscription, for it is not so much the eye that sees as the intellect, which makes sense of what the eye receives by analyzing and differentiating it. Measuring and dissecting nature, a draftsman makes sense of the sensory world by abstracting out an intelligible form. He does not simply copy a retinal impression, but in his mind's eye sees the flayed body in the live model and a perspectival grid in empty space, an effort of cognition and some considerable imagination. If drawing is the differentiation of form, composition is its integration, that rule by which the parts fit together in the painting. If drawing is a relatively empirical problem, composition is largely based on principle, although Alberti still recommends the example of nature, claiming that there is no more certain and fitting way to compose than to observe nature herself. A painter must imitate nature not only by depicting it, but also by following nature's example. By analogy to the composition of the human body, all the parts of a painting should be suitably proportioned, symmetrically arranged in classical contrapposto, and woven together as if by ligaments by compositional lines. Alberti condemns painters who neglect composition by filling the pictorial space with superfluous variety, lacking any basis in geometry or role in the narrative. Alberti avows that no one can become a painter who does not know geometry, and he also emphasizes that a painter must know how to tell a good story, since each form must be located in space by a geometric order and in time by a narrative order. The Latin words for place and to put in place, locus and collocare, appear approximately 70 times in De Pictura, which is not a few in so short a text and speaks to what is essential. Placement is of the essence in a painting. Like a stage director, Alberti's direction is places everyone. The arrangement of a painting is not supposed to be random, but as rigorous as the composition of a fugue and as intelligible as Gregorian chant. Only once the lines have been placed does the painter truly begin to paint, applying color, separating light from shadow, and modeling the form voluminously. Alberti combines color and lighting under the title Receptio Luminum, the reception of light. Like drawing and composition, color is both empirical and a matter of principle. Local colors must be faithfully imitated, as must the pattern of light and shadow, by directly observing nature. Though clashing colors should not be matched indiscriminately, and shadows must not be permitted to obscure form. As a matter of principle, Colors should be selected to harmonize with one another. Shadows must be designed to describe the character of each form with clarity, and the light must be arranged to create a unified effect of chiaroscuro. Since the reception of light concerns both the description of form and the unity of the composition, coloring is not strictly separable from drawing and composition. In fact, color is the perfection and completion of both. While a form can be painted in grisaille without variations in hue or intensity, no form is complete without tone. Light not only reveals the form, but creates it for the purposes of a painting, which is formless and void without the separation of light from darkness. Contour lines and cross-contour lines can assist in the illusion of volume and depth, but line is only the skeleton of a painting, which is fundamentally an arrangement of color. To paint form is to paint the reception of light. Pliny the Elder tells of a legendary competition between two of the greatest painters of classical Greece, Zeuxis and Parrhasius. Zeuxis presented a painting of grapes, which was so convincing that birds attempted to eat them. Parrhasius then presented his painting, veiled by a curtain. When Zeuxis attempted to lift the curtain, he discovered to his amazement that the curtain was the painting. Zeuxis had tricked the birds, but Parrhasius claimed the laurel because he had deceived a fellow artist. The moral of the story is that appearances can be deceiving. It would appear that the goal of painting as an art of persuasion is to paint the most persuasive illusion. Many paintings make a rationalistic argument by corresponding with minute precision to appearances, but the best paintings make a much stronger argument by employing all three of Aristotle's methods of persuasion. By appeal to reason, authority, and emotion, the greatest works of art take aim at a more elusive goal than the mere imitation of appearances. Never let it be supposed that anyone can be a good painter if he does not clearly understand what he is attempting to do, writes Alberti. He draws the bow in vain who has nowhere to point the arrow. The great obstacle to painting is that the target is always moving. Even when the artist's model manages to stand still, nature is never static, but always in the process of becoming what she is. Never does she appear in an ideal form, ready to be copied. A painter thus has not only to hit the bullseye, but to conceive in his mind's eye the target that he intends to hit. He has not only to paint what he sees, but to compose what he wants to see. As noted already, the challenge of composition is twofold, both geometric and narratival. To paint not only objects, but also a subject. To paint time no less than space. To paint the appearing as well as the appearance of things. Nature is spatialized and taken apart in the mind's eye, the better to see nature in motion. The painter dissects cadavers the better to see the living body in action, and he studies the dead in search of eternity, where the deeds of men dismembered by time have been put back together again. To create an illusion of depth on a flat plane is quite the trick, but to create the illusion of movement and animation with stationary brushstrokes is just short of a miracle. Following Petrarch's theory of poetry, Leon Battista Alberti took for granted that history should be the painter's subject matter. History painting is the name coined by Alberti for the foremost genre of Renaissance painting, though the name is slightly misleading in translation, since la storia in Italian is not strictly limited to historical events, but may denote a fictional story as well. Prior to the 16th century, history painting was actually the only genre besides portraiture, while other genres such as landscape and still life only fully emerged in the 17th century, and only landscape would ever rival the status of history painting in the academic tradition. The definitive subject of painting as a humanistic art form was always the human body, and the definitive object of painting as an art modeled on poetry was to imitate human action. Aristotle writes in the Poetics that poetry is an imitation of the action of men as it tends either to happiness or to misery. When poetry is a true imitation of life, it is morally instructive as it reveals both the nature and end of man. The best poetry answers the most profound questions. What does it mean to be fully human? Wherein does the good life consist? Although the story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius seems to imply that the point of the mimetic arts is to deceive, as if it were the point of Homer's Iliad to convince readers of the actual existence of Achilles, such an implication is clearly absurd. Whether in painting or in poetry, verisimilitude is a means to another end. The illusion is a means of persuading the viewer to enter imaginatively into a painted world. A classical painting is a little world made cunningly, like a poem by John Donne. It is a microcosm of reality from which to stand back and see the big picture. Not only does a fine painting deceive the eye, but it is more true than truth itself, plus vrai que la vérité même, as the French connoisseur Roger de Pile said. Since reality betrays little of the nature of things on the surface of things, an artist digs down deep to discover the hidden essence and bring it to the surface. Art shows what we really are. What is more, art tells us where we come from and where we are going, by reflecting the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, as Shelley writes in A Defense of Poetry. A no place of memories and of dreams is summoned out of nowhere in one's presence, if not quite into existence, in a flight of the imagination that leads mankind out of its fallen condition into another creation where beauty reigns and truth and goodness have been made one. In this fallen world of ours, what is true is not always good, and what is good is not always true. Yet it would be a mistake for an artist to essentialize nature's deformity or ascribe its darkened aspect to the nature of being. Being is not evil but good. The gift of existence, even an existence of much suffering, is not a curse but always a blessing. Renaissance art shows the goodness of the natural world as God made it by depicting nature beautifully. Since nature is full of flaws which do not deserve to be depicted, and history is full of facts which do not deserve to be memorialized, the history painter's objective is not just to give a factual account of appearances or of historical events, but rather to tell a story which reveals the true nature of our existence, a grand narrative painted in the grand manner. Aristotle's Poetics and Aristotle's Rhetoric were not widely available in Alberti's time, in contrast to the Latin authors cited in De Pictura, but they became important sources for the academies in the 16th and 17th centuries. Aristotle's principles were a bulwark around academic history painting in defense of its preeminent status, and so landscape painters and still life painters attempted to elevate their craft by applying those principles as well. When landscape began to differentiate itself from history painting, the most ambitious landscapes by Claude Lorrain and by Nicolas Poussin were still dignified by suitably historical subject matter. The Dutch shed this pretense but clung to the aura of Claude Lorrain by painting Italianate images of the Roman countryside. Jacob van Ruysdael became an inspiration to the Romantics by turning nature into a sublime actor and animating his trees, clouds, rocks, and plains with an almost human agency. The Dutch still-life painters compensated for what their subject matter lacked in prestige with a mixture of incomparable refinement, allegory, and symbolism, most notably Jan van Huysum, whose subtlety beggars belief. Even the humble still-life paintings of Jean-Siméon Chardin, whose unassuming manner is far less pretentious than the imposing craftsmanship of the Dutch, may justly be described as inventions, because they have a case to make. Chardin's masterful painterliness instructs in the craft itself and uncovers the life of the objects he painted in the discernible traces of a human story. Of Aristotle's three modes of argument, the appeal to authority calls for particular attention. The only authority recognized by the modern world is that of the sovereign, autonomous subject, for what is the meaning of enlightenment but man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity by acting according to his own understanding without the guidance of another. The pre-modern world of the 15th century had rather more respect for authority, though there was only one authority which could be recommended to artists by Alberti, with a narrow exception made for classical statuary, inspiring the practice of learning to draw from plaster casts, namely that of nature, as a book written by God. Never doubt that the head and principle of this art, and thus every one of its degrees in becoming a master, ought to be taken from nature. Alberti discourages the painter from copying other painters lest one adopt another's mannerisms, and the same view is expressed repeatedly in Leonardo's notebooks. This exclusive authority of nature ended with the Renaissance. Although the appeal to authority is the weakest basis on which to make an argument, as St. Thomas Aquinas ironically claimed on the authority of Boethius, There is more certainty in a divinely inspired authority than in fallible human reasoning. By crediting Michelangelo in all seriousness with divine inspiration, Giorgio Vasari made a bold claim about Michelangelo's authority. Divine revelation has precedence over natural revelation, and so the divine Michelangelo took precedence over nature. The slavish imitation of Michelangelo turned out to be short-lived, but nature's authority was never again exclusive. Once the craft had reached the least degree of sophistication, it only made sense to build on what others had done. Derivative though it may be to imitate Rembrandt, it is stupid to reinvent the wheel for fear of being derivative. Rembrandt's protégés such as Ferdinand Boll certainly had no compunction about replicating his skill set. Artists trained in the academies rather than by apprenticeship were taught to look askance at servile imitation, but even academic artists did not see any intrinsic conflict between derivation and originality, as they based their own inventions like a legal argument on sound precedent. Academic artists invariably built atop one another's accomplishments in a highly deliberate, systematic way. Derivation of a kind epitomized by the works of Raphael was the pivot on which invention turned, which is why Raphael became the most celebrated representative of the Italian Renaissance in the academic tradition. Even though he was not quite the leading star of Vasari's Lives or of Dolci's dialogue, Raphael was more beloved than Michelangelo or Titian by standard-bearers of the academic tradition, such as Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, because Raphael showed them how to develop a unique style within the strict limits of tradition. As Joshua Reynolds explains in his Discourses, what distinguishes the works of Raphael is that they illustrate a sustainable model of originality through creative imitation, immune to the diminishing returns of unruly Michelangesque genius. The ideas first of Perugino and Leonardo, and later of Sebastiano del Piombo and Michelangelo, were absorbed in Raphael's art and without drastic alteration used to produce a new style of the highest caliber, more graceful than his diverse sources of influence. There was also a mythic appeal to Raphael's personal narrative on account of his premature death, long before his own genius for invention had been exhausted. His unrealized potential became emblematic of the possibilities latent still in the craft of painting, which each subsequent generation would strive to realize. Not only did Raphael show how the thoughtful recombination of previous ideas could furnish opportunities for innovation sufficient to rival the highest standard of art, but the logic of his myth implied that the progress of the craft could be sustained indefinitely. By following Raphael's example, artists continued to innovate, and on the rare occasion that they pushed the boundaries of tradition, they did so to advance the craft rather than tear it down. The first generation of Baroque painters cannot be credited with improving the art of painting in the same way that Leonardo had surpassed Verrocchio, or that Michelangelo had surpassed Domenico Ghirlandaio. The art of Caravaggio was in no way superior to the masterpieces of the High Renaissance. Despite Caravaggio's reputation as a radical who rebelled against classical dogmatisms, one would be hard-pressed to identify so much as a single unprecedented idea in Caravaggio's work. Everything that Caravaggio did, to which his ambivalent biographer Giovanni Bellori objected, was done on the very highest authority. Caravaggio's use of starkly illuminated figures against a dark, flat background had been around for nearly 200 years, already to be seen in portraits by Jan van Eyck from the 1420s, and by the late 16th century was even being deployed in a style similar to Caravaggio's by Jacopo Bassano. Any number of Venetian painters had similarly gritty, naturalistic draftsmanship, most notably Paolo Veronese, whose figures like Caravaggio's are often clothed not in timeless classical drapes, but according to the fashions of the day. The priority which Caravaggio placed on still-life elements in his history paintings may have been uncharacteristic of mannerism, but it was entirely consistent with the tenets of Renaissance theory. Alberti asserts in De Pictura that the history painter should master more than just the human figure, up to and including everything worthy of being seen, to do justice to the genre. Caravaggio was not the first to work exclusively from the live model, which was only typical of academic instruction and strongly recommended by Alberti. The posing of Caravaggio's figures invariably includes references to Michelangelo and Raphael, whose designs were circulated in reproduction and often used as visual references by artists. The familiar hand of Michelangelo's Adam in the Sistine ceiling appears as the hand of Christ in Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew, for example, as does the beardless visage of Christ from Michelangelo's Last Judgment in Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, to which Bellori took exception, even though it was motivated by the story, given the disciples' failure to recognize Jesus. There is scarcely a single painting by Caravaggio which does not contain similar quotations from other works of art. Working from a disarmingly simple array of tried-and-true ideas, Caravaggio discovered new expressive possibilities fit for a new era. Caravaggio's genius lay in the deployment of his sources, in which he found space for rhetorical invention. Recognizing as yet unrealized potential in the work of his precursors, he managed to stake out unexplored territory within the limits established by that prior generation. So far from reducing his art to plagiarism, derivation is what enabled Caravaggio to transcend the insipid mannerism practiced by Giuseppe Cesari, the Cavaliere d'Arpino, whom Caravaggio assisted as a painter of still-life elements when he first arrived in Rome, and actually rival the achievements of the Renaissance rather than mimic them. The judicious eclecticism of the Baroque harkened back to the collaboration of Michelangelo and Sebastiano del Piombo. When the Sistine ceiling was unveiled in 1512 to great applause, it was somewhat overshadowed by Raphael's Stanza della Segnatura, whose coloring was preferred over Michelangelo's. One can imagine his disappointment, having created one of the greatest works of art ever made, only to be outdone within the hour by an imitator. Determined to rise to the occasion, Michelangelo struck up a friendship with the new arrival from Venice, Sebastiano, who brought with him new coloristic techniques of oil painting with a richer tonality, harmony, and atmosphere. Together, they set out on a mission to dethrone the impertinent, fair-faced young upstart from Urbino. Michelangelo schooled Sebastiano in his methods of drawing and even contributed his own hand to Sebastiano's paintings, most notably to the Pietà, painted in 1517, and the Raising of Lazarus, painted in 1519. Not to be outdone, Raphael responded by stealing from Sebastiano as he had from Michelangelo and painted his own Transfiguration in 1519 in a comparably impressive style of coloring, which once again, to the great irritation of his competitors, took the laurel, though for the last time, as the painting was first displayed alongside his casket. For centuries to come, Raphael's Transfiguration was hailed as the greatest ever painted in oil. The ambition to unite the Venetian and Florentine schools did not end with the frustrated collaboration of Michelangelo and Sebastiano, but was carried on by Caravaggio's contemporary, Annibale Carracci. At the Academy in Bologna, founded in 1582 by Annibale Carracci, his brother Agostino, and cousin Ludovico, students were taught selectively to combine the best qualities of the best masters. In a piece of doggerel by Agostino in praise of the eclecticism of the Mannerist Niccolò dell'Abate, the doctrine is summarized in poetic fashion. Whoever a goodly painter seeks to be should take the Romans' drawing to his aid, movement from the Venetians and their shade, and worthy coloring from Lombardy. The awesome Michelangelo must see, the truth to nature Titian has displayed, the pure and sovereign style Correggio had, and of Raphael just symmetry, Tibaldi's basis, and his decoration, invention of learned Primaticchio's own, and just a little grace from Parmigianino. But leaving so much study and vexation, set him to imitate those works alone, which here were left us by our Niccolino. Although the school of the Carracci was the most conservative school of the early Baroque, which later earned them the high praise of Joshua Reynolds and the savage criticism of John Ruskin, the Bolognesi could justifiably call themselves the Academy of the Progressives, l'Accademia degli Incamminati, since their conservative methods of derivation kept alive the most ambitious progress. Even a genius as uninhibited and licentious as Peter Paul Rubens followed the same principle of judicious eclecticism, admirably concealed by the virtuosity of his manner. The fluidity of Rubens' form combines the most diverse precedents in a unified style, which was not pedantically synthesized but organically reconstituted. It was not for nothing that Rubens spent years of his early career traveling Italy and making copies of the masterpieces of Italian art, as it was Rubens more so than any other who achieved the coveted union of Titian and Michelangelo, combining harmonious Venetian colorism with Michelangesque figure drawing. The line between plagiarism and commendable derivation did become difficult to discern in the Baroque, as the most dramatic progress slowed to a crawl in Italy, and the Low Countries once again became the center of artistic innovation. Accusations of intellectual theft between rival artists were rife, including a famous dispute from the 1620s between two of the leading artists in Rome, Giovanni Lanfranco and Domenico Zampieri, better known as Domenichino. They were both of the Bolognese school and reared on the eclecticism of the Carracci. Though fellow students and collaborators in their youth, Lanfranco and Domenichino became bitter rivals in Rome, competing for major commissions as well as the wealth and fame that went with them. While sparring over a commission to paint a series of frescoes at the church of Sant'Andrea della Valle in Rome, Lanfranco attempted to discredit his rival by circulating a print of a painting by Agostino Carracci, the Last Communion of St. Jerome, which hung in a church in Bologna. It so happens that Domenichino had painted an altarpiece of the same subject in Rome with a conspicuously similar composition, and to make matters worse, it was his most celebrated masterpiece. Although the exposé struck a blow to Domenichino, his reputation was salvaged for posterity by two of art history's most respected and influential voices, Nicolas Poussin and Giovanni Bellori, who came to Domenichino's defense. Their judgment was hardly unbiased, both of them having been students in Domenichino's studio, but their arguments helpfully elaborate the criteria of derivation. In his biography of Domenichino, Bellori says of the altarpiece, "The movements, the effetti, and the actions of the figures are so different that even if there is some idea which is taken from Agostino, it does not deserve to be called plagiarism, but should be called laudable imitation." Poussin's commentary is found in his Observations on Painting, appended to Bellori's biography of Poussin. Novelty in painting does not consist primarily in a subject that has never been seen, but in good and novel arrangement and expression, and in this way a subject that was commonplace and stale becomes singular and new. Here it is appropriate to speak of the Communion of St. Jerome by Domenichino, in which the effetti and movements are different from those of the other invention of Agostino Carracci. Both Bellori and Poussin claim that the action in a painting must vary, and both claim that ideas may be repeated, though it is interesting to observe that the two of them do not agree on the nature of their cause. In Ciceronian rhetoric, there are three types of legal cases, or cause. The first is called conjectural, in which there is a debate about whether a wrongdoing has in fact been committed. The second is legal issue, which turns on the interpretation of a legal text. And the third is juridical issue, in which an action is acknowledged by all parties, but it must be decided whether the act was done rightly and justly. Poussin takes up the first cause and Bellori the third. Bellori admits that Domenichino may have taken an idea from Agostino and that this might be seen as plagiarism, but he argues that it is done rightly and justly. Poussin regards Domenichino's painting of the Last Communion of St. Jerome as the quintessence of invention. One may as well accuse the imitator of nature of plagiarizing God, by Poussin's assessment. Bellori speaks of praiseworthy imitation, but he grants that borrowing ideas is a dubious thing to do. Poussin, by contrast, sees Domenichino's imitation of Agostino Carracci as positively exemplary. To make matters more interesting, Poussin's argument replicates precisely the form of invention that he so admires in Domenichino's painting, because his own words are a quotation from Torquato Tasso, the author of Gerusalemme Liberata. Tasso was a poet whose reputation in Poussin's day was on a par with Shakespeare's and Milton's in our own. Tasso articulated a widely regarded standard of laudable imitation, lodevole imitazione, to which Bellori alludes, and from which Poussin quotes directly, just like Domenichino without attribution. Like Petrarch before him, Tasso took for granted that the subject matter from which a poet crafts a new composition should not be made up out of whole cloth by the poet, as the clay which the poet shapes is only available through other fully articulated literary works. For Tasso, as for Petrarch, this was a normative assertion as much as a practical one. The works of previous poets, according to Tasso, are the proper raw material of new poetry alone worthy of the poet's craft, as demonstrated by the dramatists of classical Athens who were generally inspired by Homer and Hesiod. Every new invention arises out of an alimentary communion by symbolically consuming the works of the archetypal father. In light of Tasso's ideas about imitation, the repetition by Domenichino, which Bellori and Poussin freely acknowledge, is cause for praise and not blame. Agostino's painting may have been Domenichino's raw material, yet such assimilation of exemplary precedents is precisely how painters are supposed to invent, by selecting the very finest material of their precursors and transforming it to their own expressive ends. An artist who uses his sources properly would neither wish to conceal them nor fear their discovery any more than Milton could have hoped to pass off the story of Adam and Eve as his own creation. Strong precedents are a buttress for bold invention, and if an artist can rival or even surpass his sources, his painting will only benefit from the comparison. Next to such imitation, capricious invention has no rhetorical depth and no authority, as if to make a legal argument without appeal to legal precedent. The prior articulation of the poet's material is a beacon whose light he reflects and magnifies through the further articulation of form in a novel and ingenious way, as demonstrated, for example, by Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Divine Comedy. Derivation was the means of poaching the aura of a venerated masterpiece. To present a new and likely unheralded work of art successfully as an object of aesthetic veneration, the as yet uncelebrated artist would defer to an origin more venerable than himself by evoking an authorship beyond himself. Aestheticized artistic practice never strayed far from its origin in religion. The work of art presents itself as a thing to be venerated, as the relic of a secular saint in a humanistic pantheon, aptly symbolized by Raphael's burial in the Pantheon in Rome. The as yet uncanonized artist would write his own hagiography by copying another's, and mythologize his own artwork by tapping the mythology of uncontested masterpieces. It was all an artist could do to present his case for canonization by summoning his witnesses between the borders of the frame through the deployment of the most authoritative sources of inspiration. The final purpose of derivation, which could not be achieved by capricious originality, was to trope previous art and deflect its aura in a coup d'etat, cloaked in homage. No artwork was ever more successful in this enterprise than Jacques-Louis David's The Oath of the Horatii. The Oath was a revolutionary work of art, which not only turned the tables of French painting, but made its influence felt across the continent for a century to come. The time was ripe for change, and with a finger to the wind, David showed the world a new kind of painting unlike anything it had seen before. Of course, he was not the first French artist of his generation to devise a style of neoclassicism. David was preceded by one Pierre Péron, whose innovative recourse to both Poussin and Caravaggio in his painting The Death of Seneca won him the Prix de Rome in 1773, just ahead of David. Péron's example would prove decisive, though with the exposition of the Oath in 1784, David eclipsed his contemporary by ambitiously enlarging on Péron's orbit of influence to create a style unparalleled for its rhetorical depth. The Oath summons an astounding range of opposing influences, including Giuseppe Cesari and Caravaggio, Poussin and Rubens, Raphael's classicism and Michelangesque mannerism, all of which are deployed against the backdrop of the antique in a humanistic battle of the ancients and the moderns. The basic composition of the Oath derives from a well-known fresco by Giuseppe Cesari in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, not far from David's studio at the time. It is a painting which similarly depicts the subsequent combat between the Horazzi and Curati, Il combattimento degli Orazzi e Curiazi, completed in 1613. Inverting the composition, the father in David's painting corresponds to the last surviving Curatio in Cesari's fresco, while the victorious Horatio opposite him is transformed into the three brothers with arms raised in salute, and the women who are in mourning likewise appear in the same relative position in both. The decision to flip the composition was a traditional device related to the technicalities of printed reproduction. Before photography, The only way a painting could be reproduced was to draw it by hand and transfer the design onto a piece of wood, metal, or stone, which when printed would rotate the image 180 degrees, unless care was taken to draw the image in reverse. Considering that far more people would have seen reproductions of Cesari's fresco than ever saw the original, rotating the composition of the oath would paradoxically have made the source material more recognizable rather than conceal it. Besides the correspondence of subject matter, the invocation of the Cavaliere d'Arpino was especially significant in light of David's avowed debt to Caravaggio for the starkness of his lighting and the volume of his forms. As noted above, Cesari was Caravaggio's maestro in Rome, for whom he worked as an assistant painting still-life elements. Cesari was thus a target of Caravaggio's Oedipal ambitions, with obvious implications for David's painting. The dual illusion is a staging of the overthrow of the master by his pupil, redolent of David's own ambitions over his relation and erstwhile mentor, François Boucher. The synthesis of Poussin and Rubens has a similarly deep significance, recalling the eclecticism of the Carracci and the union of Michelangelo and Titian. Poussin and Rubens were the Baroque's representatives of drawing and color, around whom the so-called débat pittoresque, or colorful debate, was waged. In the very early days of the French Academy, under its first president Charles Lebrun, there took place a spirited debate in which all of the leading artists took sides between followers of Poussin and of Rubens, classicist pitted against colorist. Above all, the Poussiniste valued the principles of drawing, composition, and poetic invention exemplified by the works of Poussin, while the Rubenists were the expressionists of French art, in love with color and the sensuous handling of flesh. The rise of the Rococo represented the victory of the colorists. Fittingly, it is Poussin who instructs David's draftsmanship, while Rubens guides his coloring. David's figures are proximate to Poussin's style of drawing, implying a deep understanding of anatomical construction and classical convention. The carefully observed life drawing of Poussin's earlier work is combined with the idealization so characteristic of Poussin's later works, constructed from imagination, resulting in figures which are remarkably persuasive and beautifully classicized. Rubens' calling card is most visible in the polychromatic coloring of David's flesh tones. The bright, ruddy shadows and the exaggeration of neutral transition tones in particular are both hallmarks of Rubens' influence. For the reader unfamiliar with the technicalities of painting, a painting is divided into regions of light and shadow. In good coloring, these divisions of tone correspond to divisions of color. Rubens' paintings typically have brighter, warmer shadows and grayer, cooler lights. Of course, a figure with hot shadows and cold lights is liable to look morbidly pale, which is not usually a thing to be desired. One solution is to place the grayest tones in the transitions between the shadows and the lights, so that the lights will feel warm and bright by contrast, even though they are much grayer than the shadows. This solution is motivated by how things actually look in nature, since halftones do get progressively grayer as they turn around to form. Rubens was a master of this sort of polychromy, in contrast to Poussin. While there is the occasional painting by Poussin with exceptional flesh tones, he was never the proverbial master of color that Rubens was. In the context of the 18th century, David's synthesis of Poussin and Rubens amounted to a declaration of a new era, adhering neither to the mannered colorism of the Rococo nor to the severity of 17th century Poussinisme, but to a new classicism, like the art of the Carracci, who had helped inaugurate the Baroque through their reconciliation of Renaissance design and color. Finally, the pointed allusions to Raphael and Michelangelo, as well as classical antiquity, invoke the tradition's founding myth of rebirth. Raphael is present most conspicuously in David's linear perspective, which employs a single, centered vanishing point, with architecture arranged around it in nearly perfect symmetry, the so-called Renaissance veduta familiar from Raphael's The School of Athens and Leonardo's Last Supper. This is significant, because outside of the Bolognese school, such an arrangement was avoided in Baroque painting. It was a glaring archaism, which would not have been lost on anyone. The influence of Michelangelo is most visible in the extraordinary tension of the brothers, whose powerful limbs radiate outward from their bodies with an expression as kinetically charged as anything Michelangelo produced in his best years. Although they are lacking in the serpentine contortions associated with Mannerist postures, the strained gesture of the brothers is reminiscent of the Michelangesque statue by the French Baroque sculptor Pierre Puget of Milo of Crotona being eaten by a lion, hardly characteristic of a suave contrapposto. The antique shows through stylistically in the painting's frieze-like arrangement, most unusually of all in the compression of the three Horatii, who overlap in a way rarely if ever seen in painting, as noted by David's critics, but common enough in relief sculpture from the ancient world. The allusion to classical antiquity is strongest in the subject matter, as a story recounted in Livy's History of Rome and dating to the era of the kingdom shortly before the founding of the Republic, a prophetic choice in 1784 under Louis XVI. According to Livy, Rome was ruled by one Tullus Hostilius and at war with the neighboring city of Alba Longa. Rather than wage a protracted and costly battle, it was soon agreed that the conflict would be decided by mortal combat between the three Horatii of Rome and the three Curatii of Alba Longa. The Curatii quickly gained the upper hand, slaying two of the Romans, leaving the third brother, Publius, alone but not entirely disadvantaged, as all three of the Albans had been wounded in the process. Publius proceeded to isolate and kill all three, winning the fight and conquering Rome's neighbor. Sadly, the story does not end there. Upon his triumphal return, Publius proceeded to murder his sister Camilla because she wept at the death of Rome's enemies, Camilla having been betrothed to one of the Alban warriors. It was this event which David had originally intended to paint, but he changed his mind to invent a scene which does not actually appear in Livy, of the three brothers swearing allegiance to Rome as their father hands them their swords, in a moment of glory as yet unstained by blood. It was an eerie foreshadowing of the oath of the tennis court, which would inaugurate the French Revolution only 5 years later. The deployment of sources in David's painting does require some expertise to recognize, though it was expertise common enough to the professional community of artists and critics at the time. Even for viewers whose familiarity with painting was more intuitive than rigorous, the visual associations were evocative of a rhetorical depth precisely because they were felt, but not recognized. David was not trying to overawe his audience with obscure knowledge of art history, but calling on well-known references which educated viewers could not fail to grasp, to awe-inspiring effect. David matched both the crowd and the critics. Whatever the academicians objected to, their objections were silenced by the authority of irrefutable exemplars. Who were the students of François Boucher to speak against Raphael and the Antique, Poussin, or Rubens? The French Academy had no authority but what it had inherited from such masters, whom David marshaled against the status quo. Artists of every stripe and every nation, from Italy's Pompeo Battoni to England's Sir Joshua Reynolds, who, although he never saw the Oath of the Horatii, was privileged to see David's The Death of Socrates, painted a few years later in 1787, rallied behind David's extraordinary new style. From the moment of its first showing, the Oath of the Horatii ascended the summit of the tradition by evincing an origin beyond the man that made it, in the signature trace of the greatest masters of the craft.